Hello, and welcome to this guide to Jekyll and Hyde, Chapter 5, The Instant of the Letter.
What is this feeling of power and drive I've never known? I feel alive. Where does this feeling of power derive, making me know why I'm alive? Like the night, it's a secret, sinister, dark, and unknown. I do not know what I seek, yet I'll seek it alone. I have a thirst that I cannot deprive. Never have I felt so alive. There is no battle I couldn't survive. Feeling like this, feeling alive. Like the moon, an enigma, lost and alone in the night. Damned by some heavenly stigma, but blazing with light. It's the feeling of being alive, filled with evil but truly alive. It's the truth that cannot be denied. It's the feeling of being Edward Hyde. Wait, what's this? Sweet miss, I thought I had lost you. It's fate, what bliss. Sweet miss, your folly will cost you dear.
And on screen at the moment you can see the user's guide with suggestions how to use this resource. Pause now if you haven't used the resource before to see how best to utilise it. Today we're going to focus then on understanding what the book's about, AO1, its language, form and structure, AO2, and AO3, its context. We're going to look at each of the key themes, and each of these will be explored in some depth, or at least the ones that link to Chapter 5. So what does Stevenson want us to remember about Chapter 5? Well, the mystery thickens as Hyde has vanished and Jekyll appears to be still covering for him. What does Stevenson tell us about Jekyll and Hyde in this chapter? Well, we have Jekyll described as deadly sick, cold, changed, shuddered. Stevenson contrasts Jekyll before and after the crime, that is, the killing of Danvers Carew. He uses the semantic field of death and disease to emphasize the effect of the murder, emphasize the effect of the murder on Sir Danvers on Jekyll. The word changed implies that Jekyll is shocked by the sins of his other half and feels remorse, whereas before he felt free to let his darker side loose. Let's look at a summary then of Chapter 5.
In Chapter 5, after the murder of Sir Danvers, Utterson goes to Jekyll's laboratory to figure out if he knows the whereabouts of Mr. Hyde. Jekyll claims that Mr. Hyde is gone for good. Jekyll shows Utterson a letter from Hyde that claims he plans to escape and that Jekyll shouldn't worry about him anymore. Utterson takes the letter and asks Jekyll who wrote his will. Jekyll admits that it was dictated by Mr. Hyde. Utterson figures that Jekyll just narrowly escaped being murdered. Utterson takes the letter and goes to Mr. Guest, who's a handwriting expert. Mr. Guest states that the letter Jekyll said was written by Mr. Hyde actually is Jekyll's handwriting. This confuses Utterson because he can't understand why Jekyll would write a letter for a murderer.
So what do we learn from this chapter? Utterson confronts Jekyll about his relationship to Hyde. Jekyll tells him he will never see Hyde again. Jekyll gives him a letter which says Hyde has escaped. Utterson is convinced that Hyde was going to murder Jekyll. Utterson asks Poole what the messenger was like, but Poole says no one came to the house. Utterson gives his letter to Mr. Guest, who confirms that Jekyll and Hyde's handwriting is the same. Utterson assumes Jekyll forged the letter for Hyde. The setting here is Hyde's part of the house. Guests would normally be received in the sophisticated part of the house. This implies Jekyll is being taken over by Hyde as we suddenly visually see his dark side. Chapter 5.
In Chapter 5 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Utterson visits Jekyll, who receives him in his laboratory looking deathly ill. Utterson asks Jekyll if he's heard about Carew's murder, and Jekyll acknowledges that he has. Utterson tells him that he was Carew's lawyer as well, and asks Jekyll if he is hiding Mr. Hyde. Jekyll swears he is not, and promises Utterson that he'll never hear from Hyde again. He then gives Utterson a letter, and asks him what to do with it, as he fears giving it to the police could tarnish his reputation. The letter is from Hyde, assuring Jekyll that he's fleeing the area and that Jekyll shouldn't worry. Utterson asks Jekyll if Hyde dictated his will, but Jekyll replies in the affirmative, and Utterson tells his friend that Hyde probably meant to murder him. As Utterson leaves Jekyll's house, he asks Poole who delivered the letter. Poole insists no letter was received, making Utterson worried. Once back in his office, Utterson asks his chief clerk, Mr. Guest, who is an expert on handwriting, to read the letter and offer his opinion on what to do with it. After inspecting the letter, Guest notices something odd about the handwriting. Guest compares the handwriting of one of Dr. Jekyll's notes to the letter. He concludes that they're the same handwriting, except they slant in the opposite direction. Utterson deduces that Jekyll forged the letter for Hyde. Hyde's sudden and intense violence leading to murder terrifies Jekyll. Though readers do not find out until the final chapter, Jekyll can promise Utterson he'll never hear from Hyde again because he is now committed to no longer taking his potion.
Now we're going to look at some extracts from this chapter and begin analysing quite what you'd say about them if these extracts come up in the exam. Stevenson presents to us an indication this is near the end of Jekyll's life by setting the chapter late in the afternoon. Stevenson implies to us the owner of the lab is a man of great scientific endeavour and skill, seemingly ironically after Jekyll's failed attempts at dissecting the human soul. Stevenson makes clear the sense of privacy here and the intimate personal part of Jekyll's house that's not seen from the outside, windowless, a metaphor that we now see inside Jekyll's mind. Stevenson gives us the image of an area that is in darkness, almost a cage whose entrance is covered with blood. Stevenson takes the time to remind us that Jekyll's view of the world is clouded. He is trapped and his view of the world is obscured by darkness. Stevenson deliberately makes clear the bond between the two men as Jekyll places the burden of his crimes in Utterson's hands to judge the sins he's committed. Stevenson gives us the impression that Jekyll is confident that he can get rid of his addiction to his darker side. The use of the word relieved implies that Utterson feels that a selfish nature is a natural one, perhaps implying the survival of the fittest. Stevenson deliberately links back to the description of the room as a cell. Utterson naively implies that Jekyll is able to escape himself. Let's look at one key quote from this chapter then in a bit more depth. I was thinking of my own character, which this hateful business has rather exposed. In this quote, Stevenson confronts us with the selfish nature of Jekyll, who chooses self-fulfillment over the community he lives in, a suggestion of a capitalist ideal against the idyllic community. Stevenson deliberately uses the term business when describing the murder of Carew, implying that Jekyll is emotionally distancing himself from Hyde, detaching himself from his responsibility. The word exposed implies that Jekyll didn't wish others to see this side of himself. He almost appears embarrassed to admit that this is a less perfect side to himself. During this chapter, we are told about Hyde's handwriting. Stevenson describes Hyde's handwriting in this chapter, and Utterson concludes that Jekyll has forged a letter for Hyde. A murderer's autograph, odd hand, differently sloped, are all quotes to describe the writing that Utterson sees. A simple conclusion would be that Jekyll's writing leans to the good, whilst Hyde is the mirror of Jekyll and so leans towards evil. If, though, you wanted to push that further, it is likely that Stevenson represents Hyde as left-handed, a feature that was once thought sinister and evil. Jekyll appears to take on the symbolic meaning of the right, and once says, "I walked in my father's hand," implying that his side is just, this side of himself is just and true. As his hands are white and comely, whilst Hyde's hands are corded and knuckly, which symbolises both his Neanderthal upbringing and his sadistic animal desires. It would be easy to think of these beliefs about the left-handed were a thing of the past, but unfortunately, many people still believe the left-handed is quite sinister today.
An Oklahoma teacher is facing some ridicule after she demonized a 4-year-old for being left-handed. 4-year-old Zaid went to Oaks Elementary School in Oklahoma, and apparently when he was writing with his left hand, the teacher confronted him about it. According to the boy's mother, she says, "I asked, is there anything his teachers ever said about his hands?" And he raises the left one and says, "This one's bad." Now, apparently she noticed that he was doing his homework with his right hand, and he was really struggling because he doesn't write with his right hand. And so she looked into it a little bit and found out, oh, so my kid got ridiculed because he was writing with his left hand. Sands sent her son's teacher a note, and she replied with a copy of an article that described left-handers as, quote, unlucky, evil, and sinister.
The stuff people believe is unbelievable. Like, she's an adult. She's a teacher of children.
Yeah.
She's gone through her whole life believing, like, if she sees somebody writing left-handed, ooh, watch out for that one. Sinister.
She even, the article even said, for example, the devil is often portrayed as left-handed.
Oh, well, okay, then. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. Well, that's good hard evidence.
What's wrong with us? Now we're picking on kids.
Yeah.
Now we're picking on kids. That's the society we live in.
Oklahoma, that's not okay. Okay. So here's the interesting part of the story. Other than this woman's insane, and a lot of people support her. Like, so she didn't get suspended. The schools appears to be largely backing her.
Worrying times then in Oklahoma. Now let's look at the key themes in Jekyll and Hyde. Well, the first thing we notice is the setting described at the beginning of the paragraph. In this chapter, Stevenson further personifies London as a dying man, whose judgment is clouded by a fog of uncertainty. The former majesty of London as a capital of the world is said to drown and be smothered. This personification is extended as its streets are said to be arteries that Stevenson invites us to see as clogged with the fog of Hyde's evil, the smog of industry, or the unknown future of the nation. We are also met with a description of Jekyll and Hyde's laboratory. At the start of the chapter, we invite us to see the recesses of Jekyll's home, a place Hyde resides, and the ordered cleanliness of the dissecting room and laboratory appears to be a state of chaos, reflecting Jekyll's own mind at this point in the book. The setting is more supernatural than scientific. Dissecting rooms implies an autopsy, or at the time associated with corpse stealing, confronting us with the idea that we are witnessing a battle in Jekyll's own mind. We are in Hyde's territory, so it implies that Jekyll is losing. The semantic field of darkness is used, dingy, distasteful, dimly, to make clear that the place is not supposed to be seen and creates a gothic atmosphere. The description also implies illness and decay, with quotes lying gaunt and silent, and windows barred with iron, further implying the room of discovery and exploration has become mankind's prison. The room is in a state of disorder, littered, strewn, laden, all implying the fragile balance between chaos and order in Jekyll's mind. The setting of the laboratory for this chapter, and the fact it doubles as Jekyll's mind, also hints at another famous serial killer of the era, William Palmer, who is responsible for the Rudgley poisonings.
These are the eyes of Dr. William Palmer. He looks innocent enough, doesn't he? A respectable Victorian doctor in the small English town of Rudgley. His patients liked him. His horse racing friends thought he was a good sport, yet he hid a terrible secret. He was a mass murderer. Or was he? My name's Stephen Bates, and I've written a book about him called The Poisoner. It looks again at the long-forgotten case of one of the most notorious murderers of the whole of the 19th century. What scared the Victorians was that Palmer was an outwardly ordinary church-going doctor, a pillar of the community. He didn't look like a murderer. But when he was arrested in November 1855 for poisoning his best friend with strychnine, a black story emerged. It was a terrifying, deadly, newly discovered poison. It throttles its victims and causes terrible convulsions as they suffocate, killing them within minutes. No one had ever been charged with strychnine poisoning before, but many of Palmer's nearest and dearests had died suddenly recently. His young wife, his brother, his mother-in-law, 4 of his 5 children, other friends too. Palmer was not convicted because of a police investigation, but because of a vengeful stepfather of his victim, convinced that his dear boy had been poisoned. He hunted Palmer down remorselessly. And, more troubling still, not an ounce of poison was ever found in his victim's body. Was this a massive miscarriage of justice, or was Palmer guilty as charged? For my book, I went back to the original records, witness statements, and newspaper reports. I found Palmer's original medical notebook. There were the threatening letters from the moneylenders. If anything unpleasant occurs, you must thank yourself. Some of these documents were unread for 160 years. By the time of his arrest, Palmer owed the equivalent of more than £1 million today. He was a desperate man. It's a fascinating slice of Gothic Victorian life,
So another possible source of inspiration for Stevenson, William Palmer, the committer of the Rudgley poisonings. Let's look closer at the theme of science then, which obviously features quite prominently in this chapter. The novella is written in a very factual, clinical way, almost without emotion, the chapter heading itself Instance of the Letter, implying reservation and a distance from the events themselves. The tone of the book almost seems curious rather than an investigation of a crime or criminal acts. It is almost written from a typical Victorian logical standpoint, a scientific journal of the facts that Utterson is given. This offers us an insight into the society turning away from myth, legend and Bible studies and moral values, particularly in the form of Utterson, who offers very little judgment on what he sees and witnesses. However, just like Jekyll, Stevenson often leaps from facts into metaphorical description, veering away from logical and facts of the case into a more romantic, atmospheric, darker description. This copies the narrative of Jekyll and Hyde. Let's look then at the theme of religion. In this chapter, we see Jekyll face the full horror of Hyde's crimes. It is in this moment of horror that, rather relying on his scientific knowledge, Jekyll turns to God for help and salvation. He calls upon a higher power than man to help him, reminding us that although the scientific thinking was growing, ultimately Britain still wanted to believe and rely on its Christian roots. He isn't the only character who uses the quote, "I swear to God," cried the Doctor, "I swear to God I'll never see him again." Notice how God is repeated there twice to emphasise its importance. Jekyll appears to reference heaven and hell in this chapter, implying that he will see his sins again after this world has ended. Stevenson explores the power of science and the effect it can have on man, yet his scientists still serve as God-fearing men. Here's a bit more detail then on the link between religion and science in the book.
Today we're going to be tackling some of the most problematic issues even in our modern society. The debate between science and religion. In 1859, when Stevenson was 9 years old, the famous Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of Species. Many people saw this as an attack on religion, as the book made it impossible for God to have created the world in just 6 days. The book came out during a time when many people saw science and a belief in religion and the supernatural as being at odds with each other. Many people felt that they had to choose between the two. More people believed that science was dangerous and that they were meddling in matters that only God could control. There are a number of religious references scattered throughout. Victorian society was extremely religious. One particularly prominent branch of Christianity was the evangelicals. They considered mankind to be naturally sinful, that hard law of life which lies at the root of religion, and therefore needing to move from a place of darkness into the light. This can only be achieved through seeking forgiveness from God and living according to strict moral rules. The rules enforced that were derived from religion are being questioned by Stevenson. Many Victorian taboos were based on things that stem from religious ideas about mankind. Self-restraint and modesty was considered pious, or godly traits which indulgence and flamboyancy was certainly not. Religion is both a social and a personal issue, so a culture of shame and hiding began. Utterson very much seems to live by society's rules. He is austere with himself and doesn't give in to temptation. However, others in the novella are not quite so strong. Stevenson wrote Jekyll and Hyde at a time where scientific questioning was becoming more socially acceptable. He examines the ideas that maybe we are all at root simply animals. The degeneration of Jekyll into Hyde shares many similarities with Darwin's theory of evolution. When we look at evolution, we think about mankind becoming more civilised, yet Hyde shows us the process in reverse. References such as ape-like and troglodyte confirm to the reader the primitive state our antagonist takes. Many Victorians thought that this view was dangerous, as the implications were that science, as well as God, had the potential to create and shape life. Stevenson doesn't just address the controversial work of Darwin, but tackles the boundaries of where scientific inquiry and the supernatural blur. He creates a tension between the world of reason and science and the world of the mystical, and seems to suggest the limits of reason when trying to understand personal identity.
Now let's look at the theme of friendship. In this case then we're looking at Jekyll and Utterson. In this chapter, Stevenson further exaggerates the close, intimate relationship between Jekyll and Utterson. As the relationship evolves, we see Utterson assume the role of Jekyll's judge and conscience, as Jekyll relies more and more on Utterson to judge his crimes and take responsibility for Hyde. Alternatively, it could be said that Utterson becomes Jekyll's conscious reasoning, his logical side, rather than his primeval moral compass. Jekyll positions Utterson to come to his own conclusions, further embedding that Hyde is a criminal and Jekyll is innocent. This leads to the realisation of the truth, later to be that much more shocking. The theme of repression. In this chapter, we see Jekyll's reaction to having his secret sins so openly on display to the world. Jekyll, like all men of the era, knew what was respectable and accepted in society. He has rules he must obey to fit in with his peers.
Victorian etiquette for men. During the American Civil War era and in Victorian times, gentlemen were held to a certain standard of social behavior. In fact, they were judged by their social graces, which would indicate whether a man was indeed a gentleman. A Victorian gentleman was also classified as a person who never inflicted pain to anyone. Not intentional at least. But what did a true gentleman do to actually be gentle? Well, you will find out in this video. Here are a couple of social rules a true gentleman had to follow. 10. Avoid self-consciousness. Be so thoughtful of the comfort and happiness of others that you have no time to think of yourself and your appearance. 9. Should you be asked to play or sing, do not refuse unless you do not wish to perform. Do not refuse simply for the purpose of being coaxed, it does not appear well. 8. Leave your ego aside. Avoid talking about yourself or about affairs which interest you only, do not talk about your ill health or your afflictions of any kind. 7. Tell short stories. When you have a story to tell it in a concise manner, do not go into every detail and branch off at every word, be direct, compact, clear, and get to the point as soon as you can. Also, do not be so rude as to interrupt another in his story, however long or tiresome it may be. 6. Basic politeness. Do not be impatient or appear listless or indifferent when others are talking. Make it a point to have the appearance of being interested in the conversation. We honestly believe this stands very true today. 5. Show particular attention to elderly people. Nothing shows a better heart or is a better sign of good breeding than kindly attention to those advanced in years. As a side note, the Bible also teaches the same thing. 4. When you are in company, do not open a book and begin reading to yourself. This is disrespectful to the company. They did not have smartphones back then, but this rule would work great for nowadays. 3. Difference of opinion is one thing, contradiction is another. While the first is no cause of offense, the second is highly improper. 2. Cleanliness is next to godliness. Be tidy in dress and habits. Make careful note of this rule. Neatness is of great importance. 1. A smiling face is pleasant to see. Cultivate a cheerful, contented look. It will do your friends a great deal of good and add much to your own pleasure. And that's it for today.
Dr. Jekyll, looking deadly sick, held out a cold hand. The realization that he could be discovered, along with being confronted with the violence and sins of his repressed self, is so powerful that it nearly kills Jekyll. The gesture here of holding out a cold hand appears to represent Jekyll looking for support from his gentleman friend Utterson, a man drowning in his own sins, looking to be saved. Jekyll is scared of what his true, repressed self is capable of, and is aware that it goes against the moral code established by the era. I was thinking of my own character, which this helpful business has rather exposed. Stevenson challenged us to see Jekyll as an arrogant scientist who's attempted to play God. Simplistically, we may think of it as shame that leads Jekyll to feel deadly sick, but Stevenson reveals it's simply the idea of being exposed that the reputable Dr. Jekyll fears. He is more concerned by others' opinions of him rather than the murder of Carew itself. Some key quotes then from this chapter that you could use in your essays. What does Stevenson want us to think of at the end of this chapter? Stevenson sets up the trust between Jekyll and Utterson and the difference between the two men in Utterson's mind. This is an atmospheric chapter that sets us up to the horrifying conclusion. Here then are 3 key quotes from the chapter with grade 5 explanations underneath each one. As the novella develops, Stevenson creates an atmosphere of suspense. Now let's look at last at some essay skills you could use to help your essay writing with the ideas covered in this clip. The essay question we're going to focus on today is around the theme of secrecy, which obviously closely links to repression. So use these videos and what they say about repression to answer this question. Here then is the theme of secrecy, the question at the top there, and an extract the exam board will give you to help you out.
"This is a sad business about Sir Danvers," he said. "Yes, sir, indeed. It has elicited a great deal of public feeling, returned Guest. The man, of course, was mad. I should like to hear your views on that, replied Utting. It is between ourselves, for I scarce knew what to do about it. It is an ugly business at the best. But there it is, quite in your way, a murderer's autograph. Guest's eyes brightened, and he sat down at once and studied it with passion. No, sir, he said, not mad, but it is an odd hand. And by all accounts a very odd writer, added the lawyer. Just then the servant entered with a note. Is that from Dr. Jekyll, sir? Inquired the clerk. I thought I knew the writing. Anything private, Mr. Utterson? Said the clerk. I thought I knew the writing. Anything private, Mr. Utterson? Only an invitation to dinner. Why, do you want to see it? One moment. I thank you, sir. And the clerk laid the 2 sheets of paper alongside, and sedulously compared their contents. Thank you, sir, he said at last, returning both. It's a very interesting autograph. There was a pause, during which Mr. Utterson struggled with himself. Why did you compare them, Guest? Struggled with himself. Why did you compare them, Guest? He inquired suddenly. Well, sir, returned the clerk, there's a rather singular resemblance. The 2 hands are in many points identical, only...
As you can see, I've now annotated the extract slightly, and what I've done is look for the quotes to tell me something about secrecy. The ones in red are the ones that I thought would make a good PEE, or Point Evidence Explain paragraph. The ones in green are the ones I'd want to spend a bit more time on and really analyse and look at individual words from. You'll notice the red ones, there's quite a few red ones there compared with the short number of greens. I'm bearing in mind how long in the exam I actually have to write my answers. I don't have the opportunity to analyse every single quote. But it's also important that I look at a range of quotes from this extract as well as the novel as a whole. This then comes from the middle of the novel, so this would form my middle paragraph, perhaps paragraph 3 or maybe paragraph 4 of my response. The exam board only give me this 1 page to work with, so I've got to remember quotes about secrecy from the beginning of the book and the end of the book, but obviously they give me the middle here. This then is what I'd say about the quotes in red. Notice how short my answers are, around about a sentence per quote there. And now I've got 3 PEE paragraphs then, or at least my evidence and explanations. My point for each one would simply just use the word secrecy back to the exam board to keep my answer focused. Then I look at the green quotes. Notice immediately the answer a lot more detailed as I begin to look at particular parts, comment on technical devices being used. In this case, a simile. And here again, looking at the words differently sloped and using what I said about handwriting earlier to make that into a much more valid, more interesting point. Now, here is a bit more detail on the theme of secrecy to help me understand the theme in much more depth. The key information is in red, but please pause the video and make notes on what's on the screen there. And here would be a range of key quotes I could use for this essay as a whole. 7 in total, with number 4 being the one that I've taken from chapter 5. You notice on the left hand side is the quote itself, and on the right hand side is my explanation of what I could say about it. What I would do is note down these quotes, or at least part of these quotes, and brainstorm around the explanation on the right hand side. This would give me my quote notes for this theme, and many of these quotes could also fit with other themes you could be asked as well. So I hope that's a useful revision guide or a bit of revision for you to do, in this case on the theme of secrecy or the theme of repression. Thank you then for listening to this guide to Jekyll and Hyde with a focus on chapter 5.